I was a chef they sabotaged with bad reviews, until I proved the owner paid for fake ones. And the first sign something was wrong came when I watched Marcus Chen slip his phone back into his jacket pocket the moment I walked into his office that Tuesday morning. His fingers lingered on the device for just a beat too long. His eyes darted toward his computer screen, then back to me, and I caught the faint flush creeping up his neck. 23 years in professional kitchens had taught me to read the subtle tells of guilt, the micro expressions that betrayed a lie before it even left someone's lips. Marcus gestured toward the chair across from his desk with the kind of forced casualness that made my stomach tighten. The morning light streaming through his office windows caught the sweat beading along his hairline. Despite the aggressive air conditioning that kept the restaurant's back offices at a constant 68 degrees. I'd been executive chef at Meridian for 18 months. 18 months of 80-hour weeks, of building a menu that had transformed a failing downtown restaurant into something people actually talked about. The food critics had been kind. The local food bloggers had been enthusiastic. Our weekend reservations were booked solid through the next quarter. But Marcus wasn't meeting my eyes as he shuffled papers on his desk, and that told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. The termination letter was already printed, already signed. I could see my name in bold letters at the top of the document, even though he tried to angle it away from my view. The careful legal language, the bland corporate phrasing about performance issues and strategic realignment, all of it prepared in advance. All of it designed to protect him from the wrongful termination lawsuit he probably assumed I'd file. He spoke in measured tones about recent customer feedback, about concerns from the front-of-house staff, about the need for fresh perspectives in the kitchen. His words washed over me like background noise while I studied his face, cataloging every nervous twitch, every sideways glance, every tell that confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't about my performance. This was about something else entirely. The reviews had started appearing 6 weeks ago. Detailed, scathing assessments of dishes I'd never served, complaints about service issues that didn't align with our actual operations, horror stories about food poisoning incidents that our health department inspections showed had never occurred. They appeared on Yelp, Google Reviews, TripAdvisor, and a dozen smaller platforms I'd never heard of. Each review was different enough to seem legitimate. Different writing styles, different complaint patterns, different supposed visit dates, but they all shared certain characteristics that had nagged at me from the beginning. The reviews focused heavily on the food rather than the overall dining experience. They mentioned specific menu items by their exact names as listed on our website. Most tellingly, they all contained subtle technical details about cooking methods that only someone with professional kitchen experience would know. Marcus finished his rehearsed speech and slid the termination letter across his desk. His pen, a heavy silver Mont Blanc that he'd probably bought to make himself feel more important, clicked against the glass surface with nervous, staccato beats. I didn't touch the letter. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and watched him squirm under my steady gaze. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. The clicking of his pen grew more rapid. 23 years in professional kitchens had also taught me patience. The ability to wait, to watch, to let pressure build until it reached exactly the right moment for action. Marcus wanted me to react, to argue, to give him an excuse to call security and have me escorted out like some kind of threat to his business. I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I stood slowly, smoothed my chef's coat one final time, and walked toward his office door. Behind me, I heard his chair creak as he shifted his weight, probably expecting me to turn around and make some kind of scene. I didn't turn around. I opened his door, stepped into the hallway, and made my way through the restaurant's back corridors toward the kitchen. My kitchen. The space I'd transformed from a chaotic, grease-stained disaster into something that actually functioned. The morning prep crew looked up as I entered. They'd been with me since the beginning, had learned my systems, had bought into my vision of what this place could become. Their faces showed confusion, concern, the beginning recognition that something was wrong. I moved through the kitchen methodically, gathering my personal knives, my notebook of recipes, the small collection of tools and equipment I'd brought from my previous position. My hands remained steady as I packed everything into my knife roll, but my mind was already racing ahead, already beginning to piece together the shape of what I'd need to do next. Because I was going to do something. Marcus Chen thought he could destroy my reputation with fake reviews, and then simply discard me like yesterday's fish special. He thought 18 months of my life, 18 months of building something meaningful, could be erased with a termination letter and a handful of carefully crafted lies. He was wrong. The morning prep crew watched me pack in silence. I could see the questions in their eyes, but I wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly what I was dealing with and what Marcus thought he could gain by destroying me. I finished packing and headed toward the back exit. The alley behind Meridian smelled of old grease and restaurant waste, but the November air felt clean compared to the suffocating atmosphere of Marcus's office. I stood there for a moment, letting the cold bite into my skin, letting the reality of what had just happened settle into my bones. Then I pulled out my phone and started making calls. The first call was to Derek Santos, my sous chef from my previous position at Blanc. Derek had moved on to a consulting firm that specialized in restaurant reputation management, a fancy way of saying they helped restaurants deal with online review manipulation. If anyone would know how to trace fake reviews back to their source, it would be Derek. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd been expecting this call for weeks. He'd seen the reviews, had been tracking them across multiple platforms, had already started building a preliminary case file. Derek was thorough that way, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always preparing for the worst-case scenario. We arranged to meet that afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, away from the restaurant industry's usual haunts. Derek's voice carried an edge of excitement that told me he'd already found something significant, something that would give me the leverage I needed. The second call was to Maria Gonzalez, a food blogger who'd been covering the local restaurant scene for nearly a decade. Maria had built her reputation on honest, unbiased reviews and had little patience for the kind of manipulation that was becoming increasingly common in the industry. She answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with professional curiosity. Maria had noticed the pattern too. The sudden flood of negative reviews for a restaurant that had been performing well, the timing that seemed designed to coincide with the city's annual restaurant awards nominations, the suspicious similarity in language and focus across reviews that were supposedly written by different customers. She'd been planning to investigate on her own, but my call gave her something more valuable, an inside perspective, a chef who could speak to the technical inaccuracies in the reviews, someone who could provide context that would turn her investigation from speculation into solid journalism. The third call was to my lawyer, not because I planned to sue. Wrongful termination cases were expensive, time-consuming, and rarely worth the effort, but because I needed to understand exactly what legal protections I had, what I could and couldn't do, what lines I absolutely could not cross in whatever came next. The lawyer's advice was simple. Document everything, save everything, assume that anything I did would eventually be scrutinized in court. If Marcus was willing to fabricate reviews to destroy my reputation, he'd probably be willing to fabricate evidence to destroy me legally as well. By the time I finished the third call, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a strip mall, 15 minutes from downtown. The November sky had turned the color of old pewter, and a light rain was beginning to speckle my windshield. I sat there for a long moment, watching the water droplets form and merge and run down the glass in chaotic patterns. Then I started my car and drove home to begin the most important work of my professional life. My apartment was sparse, functional, the home of someone who spent most of his waking hours in a restaurant kitchen. But it had one thing that was going to prove invaluable: a home office setup that I'd been using to develop menu concepts and track food costs. 2 monitors, a fast internet connection, and the kind of organizational software that allowed me to break complex problems down into manageable components. I spent the rest of the morning creating spreadsheets, review platforms, dates, specific complaints, writing patterns, technical details that didn't align with reality. By noon, I had a comprehensive database of every negative review that had appeared from Meridian over the past 6 weeks. The patterns were even more obvious when I could see them all laid out in spreadsheet form. The reviews clustered around specific dates, always on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, always during slower periods when fewer legitimate customers would be dining and posting their own reviews. The language patterns showed subtle but consistent similarities. Certain phrases repeated across supposedly different reviewers, the same unusual word choices, the same tendency to focus on technical cooking details rather than the overall dining experience. Most importantly, the reviews contained factual errors that revealed the reviewers had never actually been to the restaurant. Menu items that were described incorrectly, dining room details that didn't match our actual layout, complaints about service policies that we'd never implemented. But the smoking gun was in the technical details. 3 different reviews mentioned that the duck breast was overcooked and rubbery. We'd never served duck breast at Meridian. Our protein menu focused on locally sourced beef, pork, and chicken, with fish specials that rotated based on seasonal availability. Duck had never appeared on any iteration of our menu, not even as a special. Someone was writing reviews based on assumptions about what an upscale restaurant might serve, rather than knowledge of what we actually served. Someone who understood cooking techniques well enough to use the right terminology, but who didn't know our specific menu well enough to avoid obvious mistakes. The afternoon meeting with Derek confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. His reputation management firm had developed sophisticated tools for tracking review manipulation, and he'd been running Meridian's reviews through their analysis software for the past month. The results were damning. IP address analysis showed that 17 of the 19 negative reviews had originated from the same small cluster of addresses in the downtown business district. Browser fingerprinting revealed that multiple reviews had been posted from the same devices, despite supposedly being written by different customers. Most tellingly, the posting patterns showed a level of coordination that suggested a single person or organization was managing the entire campaign. Derek's firm had seen this before. Business owners who wanted to eliminate competition, landlords who wanted to break leases with successful tenants, investors who wanted to depress a restaurant's value before making an acquisition offer. The techniques were always similar. Flood the target with negative reviews, time the campaign to coincide with critical business periods, use just enough technical sophistication to avoid the most obvious detection methods. But Derek had also uncovered something that sent a cold thrill through my chest. The IP addresses weren't just from the downtown business district, they were specifically from the building that housed Meridian's corporate offices. The reviews weren't coming from competitors or random trolls. They were coming from inside Marcus's own organization. The coffee shop where we met was nearly empty at 3 in the afternoon. Derek spread printouts across our small table, while I studied the data that would become the foundation of my revenge. The evidence was solid, comprehensive, legally bulletproof, more than enough to destroy Marcus's reputation and probably his business. But evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed to understand his motivation, needed to find the lever that would give me maximum impact when I finally chose to act. Derek's investigation had uncovered the technical details of the manipulation, but it hadn't answered the fundamental question, why? The answer came from Maria Gonzalez 2 days later. Maria had spent those 2 days working her network of contacts in the local restaurant industry, following paper trails and financial records that most people didn't even know existed. Food bloggers developed relationships with health inspectors, liquor licensing officials, commercial real estate agents, all the behind-the-scenes players who really understood how the restaurant business worked. Her investigation had uncovered a web of financial pressure that explained everything. Marcus Chen didn't own Meridian outright. He was a minority partner in a larger investment group that had purchased the property 18 months ago as part of a downtown redevelopment project, the same project that was now under federal investigation for potential financial irregularities. The investors needed to show strong returns quickly to satisfy their own financial obligations. When my improvements to the restaurant had led to increased revenue and positive reviews, the investors had pushed Marcus to expand rapidly, to open a second location, to franchise the concept, to leverage the success into something much larger than a single downtown restaurant. But rapid expansion required capital that the investors couldn't provide, given their legal difficulties. Marcus had been shopping for outside funding, trying to find new investors who would buy into the Meridian concept. The problem was that potential investors were conducting due diligence, reviewing our online reputation as part of their assessment process. The positive reviews that had helped build our customer base were now a liability in Marcus's expansion plans. Investors wanted to see a restaurant with problems they could fix, a concept with unrealized potential they could unlock with their capital and expertise. A successful restaurant with strong reviews was less attractive than a struggling restaurant they could turn around and claim credit for improving. So Marcus had commissioned the fake negative reviews as a way to artificially depress our online reputation, making Meridian appear to be a troubled restaurant that would benefit from investor intervention. He could then present himself as the solution to problems he'd created, the experienced operator who could turn around a failing establishment with the right financial backing. It was brilliant in its cynicism. Create fake problems, then offer to solve them. Destroy the value of something successful, then profit from rebuilding it. Classic manipulation on a scale that most people would never even recognize. But Marcus had made one critical error in his calculations. He'd assumed that I would simply disappear when he fired me, that I'd move on to another restaurant and leave him free to rebuild Meridian's reputation however he saw fit. He'd underestimated the depth of my investment in what we'd built together, and he'd completely failed to anticipate that I might have the skills and connections necessary to uncover his manipulation. Over the next week, I refined my understanding of Marcus's situation through careful research and strategic conversations. The federal investigation into his investors was more serious than I'd initially realized. Allegations of securities fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion that could result in criminal charges for anyone directly involved. Marcus was trying to distance himself from his partners while still maintaining access to their capital, a delicate balancing act that required him to show progress on the expansion plans they demanded. The timeline was crucial. Marcus needed to secure new investment within the next 60 days before the federal investigation expanded to include Meridian as a potentially compromised asset. He was planning to use the fake negative reviews to justify bringing in a new investor as a controlling partner, someone who would provide the capital he needed while also giving him legal distance from his current partners. The new investor meetings were scheduled to begin the following week. Marcus would present Meridian as a restaurant with great potential but significant reputation problems that his new partner's capital and expertise could solve. He'd probably already hired a new chef, someone who would be willing to implement the expansion plans without asking difficult questions about the business's recent history. This gave me exactly what I needed: a deadline, a target, and maximum potential impact. Marcus's entire financial future depended on those investor meetings going smoothly. If something were to disrupt his carefully constructed narrative, if potential investors were to discover that the reputation problems were artificially created rather than legitimately earned, his expansion plans would collapse immediately. And if his expansion plans collapsed, Marcus would be trapped in a failing partnership with investors who were under federal investigation. The kind of situation that could destroy not just his business, but his personal finances and potentially his freedom. The revenge I'd been planning crystallized into something elegant and devastating. I started with the technical evidence Derek had uncovered. The IP address logs, the browser fingerprinting data, the posting pattern analysis. All of it organized into a comprehensive report that laid out the fake review campaign in methodical detail. But I didn't just compile the evidence. I enhanced it with context that only I could provide. I created side-by-side comparisons showing how the fake reviews described menu items we'd never served, complained about service policies we'd never implemented, and referenced dining room features that didn't exist in our actual space. I documented the technical cooking terminology that appeared in the reviews, showing how it revealed knowledge that could only come from someone with professional kitchen experience, knowledge that no ordinary customer would possess. Most damaging, I traced the fake reviews back to their sources within Marcus's organization. Derek's technical analysis had identified the IP addresses, but I was able to connect those addresses to specific employees, specific computers, specific times when those employees would have been in the office with access to the systems used to post the reviews. The evidence package was devastating, but evidence alone wouldn't be enough. I needed to ensure that the right people saw it at exactly the right moment, when it would have maximum impact on Marcus's plans. I reached out to Maria Gonzalez with a proposal. Rather than simply publishing an article about review manipulation in the restaurant industry, we would coordinate a more comprehensive exposure. I would provide her with exclusive access to all my evidence, along with my perspective as the chef who'd been targeted. In exchange, she would time her article to coincide with Marcus's investor meetings, ensuring that potential partners would see the truth about Meridian's reputation problems before they committed any capital. But Maria suggested something even better. The city's annual restaurant awards nominations were being announced the following week, and Meridian was likely to be nominated in several categories based on our performance before the fake review campaign began. If Marcus's manipulation were exposed just as the nominations were announced, it would become a major story that extended beyond the restaurant industry into broader coverage of business ethics and online fraud. The timing was perfect. The nominations announcement would draw attention to Meridian just as Marcus was trying to court new investors. The exposure of his review manipulation would destroy not only his expansion plans, but also any chance of recovering his reputation in the local business community. While Maria worked on her article, I focused on the second phase of my revenge, ensuring that Marcus's current investors learned about his manipulation before they could distance themselves from the consequences. This required a more delicate approach. I couldn't simply send them the evidence directly. That would be too obviously traced back to me and could potentially expose me to legal retaliation. Instead, I needed to plant the information where they would discover it organically in a way that would seem like the natural result of their own due diligence efforts. The solution came from an unexpected source: the federal investigation itself. Government investigators were already scrutinizing Marcus's partner's business practices, which meant they were probably monitoring communications and financial transactions associated with all their business ventures. If evidence of the review manipulation were to surface in a way that suggested ongoing fraud, it would likely trigger expanded scrutiny of Meridian as well. I reached out to a contact in the state attorney general's office, someone I'd worked with years earlier when I'd provided testimony in a case involving health code violations at a competing restaurant. I didn't present myself as someone seeking revenge. Instead, I positioned myself as a concerned industry professional who'd uncovered evidence of systematic online fraud that might be relevant to the broader investigation. The contact was interested immediately. Review manipulation was becoming a significant legal issue, with state and federal prosecutors increasingly treating it as a form of consumer fraud. Evidence of coordinated fake review campaigns could support charges of deceptive business practices, mail fraud, and wire fraud, serious federal crimes that carried heavy penalties. More importantly, the existence of the fake review campaigns suggested that Marcus might be engaged in other forms of business fraud that investigators hadn't yet discovered. If he was willing to fabricate customer reviews, what else might he be willing to falsify? Financial statements? Tax documents? Partnership agreements? I provided my evidence package through the proper legal channels, ensuring that everything was documented and admissible. Within 48 hours, the investigation had expanded to include Meridian, and federal agents were requesting records that Marcus probably assumed were safely hidden. The third phase of my revenge focused on the culinary community itself. Marcus had assumed that destroying my reputation would be consequence-free, that other chefs and industry professionals would simply accept the negative reviews at face value and move on. He'd underestimated the tight-knit nature of the professional kitchen world and the way that experienced chefs could recognize manipulation when they saw it. I reached out to my network methodically, not seeking sympathy or support, but simply sharing information. I sent Derek's technical analysis to other executive chefs, along with my documentation of the factual errors in the fake reviews. I shared Maria's preliminary findings with food bloggers and critics who'd been covering the local scene for years. I provided context to restaurant industry associations that were increasingly concerned about the impact of review manipulation on their members. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Chefs who'd worked with me over the years vouched for my professionalism and integrity. Food critics who'd reviewed my work provided counter-narratives to the fake complaints. Industry organizations offered to include my case in their ongoing advocacy for stronger regulation of review platforms. Within a week, the narrative had shifted completely. Instead of being seen as a chef who'd been rightfully terminated for poor performance, I was now being recognized as a victim of systematic business fraud. Instead of being blacklisted by potential employers, I was receiving job offers from restaurants that wanted to demonstrate their opposition to review manipulation. But the most satisfying response came from Marcus's own staff. The morning prep crew I'd trained, the servers who'd learned my plating techniques, the kitchen managers who'd implemented my systems, they began speaking out about the disconnect between the fake reviews and their actual experience working at Meridian. Their testimonials provided something that technical evidence couldn't: authentic, first-hand accounts of what the restaurant was really like, descriptions of the standards we'd maintained, stories that contradicted every major complaint in the fake reviews. When current employees began publicly defending their former chef and questioning their current management, it became impossible for Marcus to maintain that the negative reviews reflected legitimate problems with the restaurant. By the time Maria's article was published, Marcus was already trapped in a web of legal and financial consequences that would have been impossible for him to anticipate. The federal investigation had frozen his access to capital from his current investors. Potential new investors had withdrawn their interest after discovering the review manipulation. His staff was openly questioning his integrity, and his reputation in the local business community was beyond repair. But the article itself was the final blow. The perfectly timed exposure that ensured Marcus's destruction would be complete and public. Maria had crafted a comprehensive piece that traced the entire story from my termination through the discovery of the fake review campaign, presenting it as a case study in how restaurant owners could manipulate online platforms to serve their financial interests. The article included everything: the technical evidence of IP address manipulation, the documentation of factual errors in the reviews, the financial context that explained Marcus's motivation, and my perspective as the chef who'd been caught in the middle of a systematic fraud. It was published on the same day that the Restaurant Award nominations were announced, ensuring maximum visibility and impact. The response was swift and devastating. Within hours, review platforms began removing the fake reviews and launching their own investigations into Marcus's accounts. The Restaurant Industry Association suspended Meridian's membership pending a full investigation. Local food critics published follow-up pieces examining their own coverage of the restaurant and acknowledging how they'd been manipulated by the fake reviews. Most importantly, the federal investigation accelerated. Agents who'd been focusing on Marcus's investors' securities violations now had evidence of ongoing fraud that directly involved Marcus himself. The fake review campaign wasn't just unethical business practice. It was systematic consumer fraud that violated multiple federal statutes. I watched the destruction unfold from the safety of my new position as executive chef at Blanc Downtown, a restaurant that had recruited me specifically because of the integrity I'd shown in exposing Marcus's manipulation. My new employers understood that a chef willing to sacrifice his career to expose fraud was exactly the kind of professional they wanted leading their kitchen. The final phase of my revenge was the most satisfying, watching Marcus realize that his carefully constructed plan had not only failed, but had destroyed everything he'd been trying to protect. The investor meetings he'd scheduled were canceled after potential partners learned about the federal investigation. His current investors, desperate to distance themselves from additional legal exposure, forced him to sell his stake in Meridian at a massive loss. The restaurant itself closed within a month, unable to recover from the reputational damage and legal scrutiny. Marcus's personal finances collapsed under the weight of legal fees and contract penalties. The federal investigation expanded to include his personal tax returns and business dealings, revealing a pattern of financial irregularities that extended far beyond the fake review campaign. By the time prosecutors finished building their case, Marcus was facing potential criminal charges that could result in years in federal prison. But the most devastating consequence was professional. Word of Marcus's manipulation spread throughout the restaurant industry with the speed and thoroughness that only comes when a community polices its own. He was blacklisted not just by restaurants, but by suppliers, distributors, real estate developers, and investors who couldn't afford to be associated with someone who'd been exposed as fundamentally dishonest. The industry that had once offered him opportunities for expansion and growth now treated him as toxic, someone whose involvement would automatically taint any project or partnership. He'd wanted to use fake reviews to make himself more attractive to investors. Instead, he'd made himself unemployable in the only industry he'd ever known. 6 months after my termination, I received a letter from Marcus's lawyer requesting a meeting to discuss a potential settlement of my wrongful termination claim, a claim I'd never actually filed. The lawyer's carefully neutral language couldn't hide the desperation behind the request. Marcus was drowning in legal costs and wanted to resolve any potential claims before they became additional complications in his federal case. I didn't respond to the letter. There was nothing Marcus could offer me that would compare to the satisfaction of watching him destroy himself through his own arrogance and greed. He tried to use my reputation as a stepping stone for his financial ambitions, and instead he'd created the foundation for his own downfall. The restaurant industry had given Marcus exactly what he tried to give me: a reputation so damaged that recovery was impossible, professional opportunities that evaporated the moment his name was mentioned, and the knowledge that his own actions had created the circumstances of his destruction. I kept working, kept building my career, kept developing the skills and relationships that Marcus had assumed he could simply discard when they were no longer useful to him. But I also kept watching, kept tracking the consequences of his manipulation as they rippled through his life and career in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The federal prosecution resulted in convictions for wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. Marcus received a sentence of 37 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and restitution payments that would consume any income he might earn for the foreseeable future. His conviction was covered extensively in industry publications, ensuring that his name would be permanently associated with the kind of fraud that the restaurant community was working to eliminate. When Marcus was released from prison, he tried to rebuild his career in smaller markets where his reputation might not have preceded him. But the restaurant industry's memory was long and unforgiving, and the internet made it impossible for him to escape the consequences of his actions. Every potential employer who searched his name found detailed accounts of his conviction, his manipulation, and his destruction of a successful restaurant through systematic fraud. 3 years after his release, Marcus was working as a night manager at a chain restaurant in a strip mall outside the city, earning less in a year than he'd once spent on a single business lunch. His attempts to restart his career had failed consistently, not because of continued persecution, but because potential employers simply couldn't trust someone who'd been proven willing to destroy others for his own financial gain. I'd built something different in those same 3 years. My exposure of Marcus's fraud had established me as someone willing to stand up for integrity in an industry often compromised by shortcuts and deception. Restaurants competed to hire me not just for my culinary skills, but for the credibility that came with being associated with someone who'd chosen principle over convenience. The awards that Meridian might have won under my leadership were eventually presented to other restaurants, but several industry organizations created new awards specifically recognizing chefs who demonstrated exceptional integrity under pressure. I was among the first recipients, honored not just for my cooking, but for my willingness to expose fraud even when it cost me my position. Looking back, Marcus's manipulation had been a catalyst that elevated my career beyond anything I could have achieved at Meridian. His attempt to destroy my reputation had instead created opportunities for me to demonstrate the kind of character that the industry desperately needed. His fraud had provided me with a platform to advocate for the integrity that differentiated professional kitchens from mere food preparation. But the most satisfying aspect of my revenge hadn't been the professional success or industry recognition. It had been the simple knowledge that Marcus had received exactly what he tried to give others: a professional reputation so damaged that recovery was impossible, combined with the understanding that his destruction had been caused entirely by his own choices. He tried to build his success on a foundation of lies and manipulation, and that foundation had collapsed under its own weight. The fake reviews he'd used to destroy me had become evidence in his federal prosecution. The expansion plans he'd hoped to fund through investor fraud had become examples of his deceptive business practices. The reputation he tried to protect had become synonymous with the kind of fraud that the industry was working to eliminate. On quiet evenings in my kitchen, preparing for the next day's service, I sometimes thought about Marcus and wondered if he understood the elegant justice of his situation. He tried to teach me that reputation was something that could be artificially constructed, that success could be built on deception, that integrity was a luxury that practical people couldn't afford. Instead, he'd learned that reputation was the sum of consistent actions over time, that success built on lies was inherently unstable, and that integrity was the foundation that allowed someone to survive and thrive even when everything else was stripped away. The fake reviews were gone now, removed from the platforms where they'd once appeared. Meridian was closed, its dining room converted to office space for a tech startup that probably had no idea about the restaurant that had once occupied the same location. Marcus was working night shifts in a suburban strip mall, invisible to the industry that had once offered him opportunities for wealth and influence. But the lessons of his attempted manipulation lived on, integrated into industry practices and regulatory frameworks that made similar fraud more difficult and more easily detected. My case had become a teaching tool, used in business ethics courses and industry workshops as an example of how personal integrity could triumph over systematic deception. Marcus had wanted to write my story as a cautionary tale about what happened to chefs who didn't understand the business realities of the restaurant industry. Instead, he'd written his own cautionary tale about what happened to business owners who tried to build success on a foundation of lies and manipulation. And in the end, that was the most satisfying revenge of all. Not just his destruction, but the transformation of his attempted manipulation into a permanent reminder of why integrity mattered more than any short-term advantage fraud might provide. The kitchen where I worked now buzzed with the energy of a team that understood they were part of something meaningful, something built on honest excellence rather than artificial reputation. Every plate we sent out, every review we earned, every recognition we received was authentic. The kind of success that could weather any storm because it was built on the solid foundation of consistent quality and professional integrity. Marcus had tried to teach me that reputation could be manufactured, that success could be stolen, that other people's work could be appropriated for personal gain. Instead, he'd learned that manufactured reputation was inevitably exposed, that stolen success was inherently unstable, and that attempting to destroy others ultimately led to self-destruction. In trying to write the ending to my story, Marcus had written the ending to his own. And that ending was exactly what he deserved.